look forward to hearing an update. I look forward to hearing an update on the activities of the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance and the progress that they've made in the Keweenaw. So thanks so much for being with us today, Stephen, and take it away.
Okay, let me see if I can get my screen up. There we go. I think everybody can see my PowerPoint now. Joan, can you hear me okay, just for a sound check?
Perfect. Yes, everything is perfect. PowerPoint and your voice.
Okay, great. Well, first I want to say thanks to the Unitarians for inviting me to come and speak today. When I was a gay activist downstate, they frequently invited me, and you guys are always such a great group to talk to. The church down there was so supportive of LGBTQ plus activist work, and I love talking to you because you are thinking people, you're ideas people, and you ask a lot of questions. So it's always a great conversation. I will also try to keep the talk to about 30 minutes to make sure that we have time for questions. So I titled my talk today as Toward a New Definition of Green Burial. And as it proceeds, we'll have a sense of why I called it that. And guess what? I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. Okay.
There you go.
I thought I should show you sort of quickly who the other board members are for the Green Burial Alliance. We do have a general membership that's getting close to 100 people at this point. It's a way for people to be affiliated with the organization, but the board is also a working board. Most of the activities come from board members. And I know for sure you're familiar with one board member, Jen Donovan, in the top row. You probably see a few other familiar faces there. And I wanted to point out in the center at the bottom, Jeff Dennis. He's a funeral director. And we started the tradition of having a funeral director on our board because relationships with funeral directors are so important in this work of getting green burial established on the Keweenaw. His father, Mark Dennis, served for 3 years. When Mark's term came up, we opened it up to all other funeral directors in the community who support green burial. Not all of them do. And Jeff was interested, so he has recently joined our board. So just so you have a sense of who all is involved here. Okay, there may be a delay for advancing my slides because it's, once again, it's not taking the, Okay, apparently if I click my mouse, that helps. So getting to what is green burial. We often start our presentations by defining green burial. We have usually defined it as the following: burial with no conventional embalming fluids, with no vault, and with biodegradable materials. True enough, that was a good working definition, basics, but I'm increasingly convinced that that definition has led to some of the problems that we've encountered with green burial. That, that definition of no embalming fluids, no vaults, all biodegradable materials, it kind of covers the motivation for green burial that comes from carbon footprint and ecological concerns, but it misses a lot of things. And those things that are missing has consequences. As I like to say, that definition is a lot like saying that what people love about dinner with friends is getting the right balance of fats, proteins, and carbs. Dinner with friends is about a whole lot more than fats, proteins, and carbs. So that definition is eliding a number of really important things. One of them is an important inherent desire with green burial to have a continued connection with the natural world. Now, Lower Michigan, certainly in the Midwest, that might mean prairies and plains. In other places, that might mean deserts. Here, that usually means forests. And part of the motivation that we're seeing more and more for people with green burial is that they want to maintain their connection with the natural world. And it might be people who hunt, it might be people who ski. people who run, people who just enjoy being out in nature. But that's a very important piece of the attraction of green burial for people. It also elides what I call the cuisine of burial. People have various tastes and traditions for burial. So just like people like different kinds of food, you know, spam can be very popular in some places, but gourmet meals can be very meaningful in other places. There's aspects of burial that come into play with green burial that people really like and enjoy. Or as I like to say, burial is more than just a means of disposal. It's a human activity that has flavors and traditions tied to it. Another thing that definition elides is the aesthetics. People are attracted by beauty and atmosphere, and their choices for green burial are affected by the beauty and the atmosphere of the place that they're evaluating. As I'm learning more and more, people like to imagine themselves dead in the same ways that they enjoy being alive. So the attraction that people have for a green burial location is often very much connected to what they enjoy or appreciated while they are alive. And finally, that definition that we've been using elides the social elements of burial, that even after death, people want to maintain connection to one another and who they are. That's why in conventional cemeteries, traditionally, a lot of times they were connected to churches, right? A lot of cemeteries will have religious divisions within them. People like family plots because they're connected to all of those people. And things like grave markers matter because it says who this person was and who they were connected to. So when we take the definition of green burial and we boil it down to what I'm calling fats, carbs, and proteins, we're leaving out all of these other factors that turn out to be quite important for what attracts people to green burial or any form of burial for that matter. So for contrast, here's two pictures of local green burial offerings. The one on the left, forested, it's a place that people enjoy being in. You know, the photograph is a little artistic. It's got that light shining through the trees. Looks pretty idyllic in a lot of ways. Make a great piece of marketing for it. The one on the right, an open field with a lot of bare patches. I'll talk a little bit about these two cemeteries and the differences that we have seen happen between them. And we'll start off with the big success. Because another way of putting this is, why is Chassell, of all places, so popular for green burial? Chassell has sold 40 some lots for green burial. They have had 6 green burials since they opened, and they have had the only green burials for cemeteries up here. So it's a great little natural experiment going on here. We're seeing with Chassell what success can really look like. First thing is a clear connection to the natural world. It's wooded, it's forested. Joe Youngman, who developed the Chassell green burial areas, he actually figured this out before we asked for green burial, because when he was expanding the cemetery, he did something different. Instead of clear cutting a whole section, taking out all the trees and plopping down a grid of burial plots, he left trees in places and he put little chunks of graves in between the trees. He did that for the veteran section in Chassell, and he did it for another section. And what happened immediately was that when people came to the cemetery to choose plots, they ignored the open field parts of the cemetery and they latched on to the wooded parts immediately. So Joe had this area that he could not use for conventional burial because of access issues. And he suggested that as a possible green burial area. And it was perfect because the intention was that it would remain forested, not tightly, of course, because you got to fit graves in there, but it would have that look and feel of the natural world. There's an aesthetic experience when you walk through it. and you can walk through it. There's a kind of a trail that goes through that original green area. The newer area is not quite the same because he ran out of graves in that area. So he had to open up some new ones. But it feels like you're walking through the woods. It's different than driving through a cemetery, stopping in your car, looking, and then being done. You actually get an experience from it. There's also some important social connections going on with Chassell. Best way I can sum it up is that, I'm a Laurium kid, and I've always been very attached to the Lakeview Cemetery outside of Calumet for a number of reasons. And yet they were not interested in green burial 6-8 years ago when I was interested in getting my affairs in order. And so I threw my lot in with the Green Burial Alliance, and we invested in Chassell. And I, was in the first wave of plot purchases there. And now that Lakeview is considering green burial, I have thought, would I switch? Would I give up my plots in Chassell and move to Calumet? And what I realized is, at this point, I'm friends with so many people in the Chassell area, meaning the green burial area. Like when I get buried there, I'm going to go into the land and the soil along with all of these people who I love and I just adore and who I've gotten to know in the last 6 years. I want to be with my buddies. I want to be with my peeps there. So because Chassell came on strong at the beginning, it seems to keep attracting more people who are connected to the people who are there. It's got the social connections built into it. They also decided to allow memorialization. So you can have flush memorial stones on your grave. And that is turning out to be really important to people. And we'll see how that plays out a little later on. But it does matter. It's part of that family social connection, that human need to say, I was here. And another important factor is that they were dedicated to the stakeholders from the start. Craig Austin, the sexton, is a great guy. He was a little iffy on green burial to begin with, but he came around. He understands it. Joe Youngman in Public Works, he developed these sites. We worked with them for months to get it right. They have to consider things as a cemetery, but they were also willing to consider everything that we needed and wanted as people who were interested in green burial. So we ended up with things like winter burial, which is essentially unheard of up here in the Keweenaw. We ended up with the ability for funeral attendees to participate. So they won't allow us to dig graves, but they will allow attendees to fill them in. So in several of the green burials, the word goes out, bring your shovel, because this is going to be a community effort. And it's an amazing experience. You spend time around the burial. You get to talk with people informally while you are also doing the important act of serving that person for the very last time. So pretty sure at this point that this is why Chassell is so popular. They did more than fats, carbs, and proteins. They are giving us the whole party, essentially the whole dinner experience. We can contrast that with Forest Hill in Portage Township. They were actually the first to market, the first to actually allow green burials, but they have yet to have had a single sale. Why is that? Well, the photograph kind of says it all. They dedicated a part of their conventional burial section to green burial. It's essentially a scrubby looking dirt patch kind of thing. Some of our members have made an attempt to improve it aesthetically by planting native plants, wildflower stuff. That was not successful, so it even looks more like a dirt patch right now. And there's like no social connections to it. There's no inertia happening there where, it's not gathering any energy. They do have a few areas that still are wooded, so we may try to talk to them about switching their approach. I do think that eventually Forest Hill will appeal to people who have a strong connection to Houghton and definitely want to be buried within Houghton. But right now, it's falling flat because essentially what they did was they decided to not require vaults, to not allow embalming in those areas, and to require all biodegradable materials. So they got the fats, the proteins, and the carbs, but they missed the party essentially. We are seeing a little better luck up at Evergreen Cemetery, which is just outside of Eagle River. It's in Houghton Township up in Keweenaw County. They probably have now sold 2 of the green lots. What they did was they have no room to expand. Their cemetery is completely platted out, but they dedicated 2 rows for green burials only. They also decided not to require vaults anywhere else in the cemetery. It's a beautiful cemetery, especially the older parts, not just the interesting monuments, but the trees have grown into great extent. It's got a historic feel to it. The new area is more of a grid, but still, it's a very attractive spot, especially for people who have a social connection to the Eagle River area or Keweenaw County for that matter. So we're seeing some success there. It's the only other cemetery than Chassell that has actually sold a couple of green plots. Just so that you're aware of some other sites under consideration, Jacobsville. I don't know if my mouse works here, but Jacobsville over here, practically on the shore of Lake Superior, they have a small historic cemetery there with a new section. My father's actually buried there. And I can say one reason that he was buried there was, number one, he wanted to be buried there, but number two, they allowed us as a family to fill in the grave. Lakeview would not allow us to do that. So we honored my father's wishes. My mom wasn't too keen on it, to be honest, but to satisfy me and my sister, we went with Dad's desires and went with Jacobsville. In the fall of 2019, the board there decided to allow green burial, and I worked with them a little bit. We got started on figuring out what that would look like, and then COVID hit, and as you know, everything got put on hold almost everywhere. So later this summer, I'm hoping to reconnect with the folks in Jacobsville, kind of see if they have moved their green burial rules along or not. I'm encouraging them to allow green burial mixed in with conventional burial because my mother has said she would opt for green burial. My father is there in a vault and a casket and all that business because that was the only way we could do that back in 2013. So Jacobsville, definitely on our radar. Could be happening there soon. Technically, it's permitted. Lakeview and Calumet. Amazingly, after 6 years of me gently nudging after getting rebuffed, they are taking green burial a lot more seriously. And what's exciting there is that Lakeview is a cemetery that understands trees. If you've been there, you know that they keep a canopy of trees over the entire cemetery. It doesn't feel forested, but it is shaded throughout. It's a beautiful cemetery. So they get that part. I'm not sure if they get the aesthetics of green burial, and I don't know if they understand the need to build the social connections that would make green burial successful. And I'll be frank, they're not always open to suggestions. So I slip in ideas where and when I can, but they do seem pretty serious about moving forward with green burial one way or another. I'd like to mention Eagle Harbor, a little bit under the radar. As far as we know, they don't require vaults. They also haven't wanted in the past to be known as a green burial cemetery because they have only so much room and they're trying to keep their cemetery kind of to themselves. But for people with a connection to Eagle Harbor, that's a decent option for green burial. And I think they do accept people from out of their township. but might be with significantly higher charges. One other place to watch, Schoolcraft Township, which runs the 2 cemeteries outside of Lake Linden. We're in a very preliminary discussion stage with Schoolcraft Township, but I have walked around the cemeteries with the township supervisor, and it looks like the township has some land up high between the 2 cemeteries that is hard to access, but would be really an ideal spot for green burial. They could have a very Chassell-like experience. So the supervisor and I are going to continue these conversations. He seems pretty open to doing it if they can do it low cost, which Chassell was able to do, and make it feasible in terms of getting there. I mean, the bottom line is that to get into that area, you kind of have to go up into the snowmobile trail and then back down into the property. But keep an eye out, something might be happening there in the next couple of years. So let's broaden out a little bit further from the Keweenaw elsewhere in the UP, because there's a few lessons to be learned here. Marquette. About 3-4 years ago, some of the local green burial activists there invited us to come and do a presentation, and the sexton for Park Cemetery, which is kind of in the middle of the city of Marquette at this point, he warmed up to the idea. And so he sort of just took the initiative after the city council approved it, and he created a new green burial section with 230 plots, called it Prairie Mound. And they put in a whole set of rules: no traditional embalming, no caskets, no vaults, and also no grave markers. That's an issue. Turns out that that's a turnoff for a number of people. They do offer winter burial as conditions permit. They bury in the whole cemetery in the wintertime. But they also, because they put so much money into building this mound and redoing watering systems and whatnot, they're actually charging a lot for these plots, to the point where it's prohibitive for a lot of people. So as far as we know, last I heard, they've only had a couple of plot sales in 3 or 4 years. And really, it's not very successful. Now, our contacts in Iron Mountain got a hold of us early this spring because one of the Iron Mountain cemeteries is talking about moving forward with green burial. And she was very concerned because they were talking about doing something just like Marquette. And she's aware of the problems with Marquette. So she has been trying to get them to talk with us about this a bit and get get Iron Mountain more in line with what Chassell has done, if that's possible. So we're learning a couple of important things from here. And I should mention also that I haven't seen Prairie Mound, but those who have say that it doesn't look like a prairie. It looks like a bunch of overgrown local grass, invasive species, whatnot. It doesn't have the aesthetics that people are looking for. It's not a beautiful flowering meadow kind of thing. And as we're realizing up here, nature usually needs forests. So 2 things that happened there. One is the sexton wasn't too interested in inputs from the stakeholders. So he just kind of like plowed ahead and did all of this work without really talking to people and getting them connected to it. The other thing that we've come to realize is that just the presence of the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance up here in the Keweenaw is making a huge difference. Because we keep it in the news. We're keeping this topic fresh. We're a source of information. Both Marquette and Iron Mountain, they've had a couple people who wanted to see this happen, but they never created a full-blown organization that was doing the kind of, continuing work and engagement and all of that. In one sense, it might be a mistake for us not to have done branch organizations. We could have attempted to create a branch in Marquette, use our nonprofit structure to do that. We were reluctant to do that because we're so focused here on the Keweenaw. But turns out that having an organization does make a difference. And I also want to say, people say this a lot, and I like saying it too. The Keweenaw is a special place. There is something about the Keweenaw where things can happen. Sometimes I think that it's big enough to have, and it has a university, well, two actually, that there's energy and momentum, but it's small enough that we personally know the people who make decisions, and we have connections. We're a very connected community. Marquette's kind of big and sprawling at this point. It's more city-like. But up here, we are each other's friends, families, and neighbors. And we know each other in multiple ways. Doesn't always get us too far. I know the people on the Lakeview Cemetery Board, and yet they were not interested in green burial. Of course, they think I'm that weird kid out of Lorium who's done a lot of radical stuff. So, of course, anything I bring to them is automatically suspicious. But in general, in the Keweenaw, we know the people we need to rely on and we work with. So those are some of the lessons that we have learned from this. The great thing is that Chassell is such a great success that it's really showing us what goes wrong in other locations and places, and we can keep developing those as we go. So one thing I'm still trying to develop is a definition for what is green burial. I rejected the old ones. The old one is just fats, carbs, and proteins. But a real working definition is much harder to come up with. I attempted it for this presentation. I failed. I landed on the old saying that I love, which is that for every complicated problem, there's a solution that's easy, fast, and wrong. And we've done the easy, fast, and wrong solution definition for green burial. Now we've got to do the harder work of coming up with something that really captures the human meaning of green burial, not just the scientific or ecological. So a few quick final notes before we do questions. If you're interested in green burial, we do have a website. We've made it very focused on local green burial interests, but also has all the information you might need about green burial to understand what it's about. Now that we may have a new definition, we may need to audit the site in order to sort of bring it up to speed with some of what I've told you. We have a green burial planner document that you can look through and see kind of what's involved, what are the decisions you have to make ahead of time. You can join our mailing list and get information on what we're up to. You can become a member of the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance. Another thing you can do if you're interested is visit some of these cemeteries. Check out Chassell, check out Jacobsville, check out Forest Hill, and see the dirt patch that's there right now. One other thing you can do that's essential, I like to say, get thee to a funeral director. In Michigan, nobody dies without a funeral director involved. So, Joan, we have death, taxes, and funeral directors. Add that to your list. It's part of Michigan law. But really, these folks, men and women alike, can really help you figure out how to accomplish what it is you want to accomplish. They can educate you about what's important and necessary. And they're happy to put plans on file for you. You don't have to prepay. That's a whole separate issue. Some people do it for a variety of reasons, but you can pre-plan at no cost. The other thing is funeral directors have very different personalities. So it's always a good idea to talk to a couple different ones, get a sense of who you're comfortable with, find out what they're willing to do with green burial. All of these ones are on a directory on our website. They have all said that they are prepared to support green burial, but they will support it differently to some extent. So it depends on what kind of experience you want to give to your family, friends, neighbors, and other loved ones. So the most important thing you can do probably is open up a relationship with the funeral director. And finally, just so you know what the KGBA is up to now, we are planning a Chassell cemetery tour for later in the summer. This is to give Joe Youngman a chance to showcase some of his newest green burial spots and niches, and it allows us to bring this issue back into the public attention. We are also planning a historic cemetery tour for the fall. Some of you may know a woman named Ruth Gleckler. She's agreed to do a little bit of talk at some of our local historical cemeteries, the ones that are no longer operating, but are sort of in little nooks and crannies throughout the county. And finally, we've been developing a YouTube channel for what we call our Green Burial Story Project. That was a COVID inspiration, and ties in with this developing definition of green burial. We essentially have people talking about what their own green burial story is, why they find it meaningful, why they're interested in it, what their connection is to it, and what their experience was. And in fact, Jen Donovan, she is one of the people on the channel right now, as well as 4 or 5 others. And we're hoping to build those little discussions as we go. So with that, I'm ready for discussion, questions, and answers. And I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Yes, thank you so much, Stephen. We've already learned a lot, and we appreciate you sharing with us. We do have some questions in the chat. A couple, I just wrote in there, if anyone has any suggestions for a definition for green burial, they could toss in some ideas for you to consider. And that also, and so for the rest of you, if you do have questions, please continue to add them. So we'll start with the first one, and that is from Bill Fink. He asked if you could explain the mechanics of a winter green burial.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't quite catch the question there, Joan.
Sure, I'll repeat it. So from Bill Fink, please explain the mechanics of winter green burials.
Sure. Well, I can explain how Chassell has decided to approach it. They have marked their plots carefully in ways that they can find under the snow if they need to. And they have marked their driveways through the cemetery. So, and they do that every fall before the snow starts to hit. Now, granted, Chassell is the banana belt, so it doesn't get nearly as much snow as Calumet, Laurium, South Range, those places, the higher elevations. So, but what they do is they will go through and clear a pathway to whatever green burial area they need to access. They will then blow the snow off of the top, which is another reason for why the memorial stones there need to be flush, so they can actually clear an area in the winter time. And the ground doesn't freeze, so they're comfortable with using their backhoe to dig a grave even in the middle of winter. They do not 100% guarantee it because things happen. They also will hire a contractor if they can't manage it themselves. So there are extra fees with that. But they feel pretty confident they can pull it off. So it's not guaranteed, but they can probably do it. If anything goes wrong, then generally the option is a greener embalming fluid, one that is less toxic, that's considered biodegradable. And then the body would stay in the winter storage vault, which many of our local cemeteries have, and then be buried as soon as the grave could be opened up in the spring. So there is some talk of Forest Hill doing winter burial, but there's nothing concrete about it yet. Other cemeteries, they simply will not do it. If you're going to be buried, you have conventional bonding. You are put into a building for the winter for storage, and then in the spring, you are buried then.
All right, thank you. Another question is, could you explain the environmental impact of green burial in comparison to cremation and scattering of ashes?
Yes, interesting question, because the contrast there is not between green burial and conventional burial, but green burial and cremation. And for a lot of people, when they're concerned about environmental causes, this is a judgment call. But I can say that a lot of people are switching from cremation to green burial for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that cremation is energy intensive, and it does produce a fair amount of CO2 emissions. So it's using a non-renewable resource at this point. It'll be quite a while before we have, renewable resources to the point where you can cremate bodies on a regular basis. Often cremation was attractive because people felt like we were running out of land. But one thing we're learning is that cemeteries are great wildlife refuges, especially for birds, especially when they're forested. So green burial is causing a kind of movement in conservation cemeteries in other parts of the country, where large tracts of land will get set aside as wilderness, but the one human use will be, I'll call it two human uses. The first one will be burial, and the second one will be human recreation. So there'll be outdoor activity trails through those conservation cemeteries. They'll be used for burials, but the people will be kept underground where they won't do too much harm or damage. And that's another reason why people are switching. Turns out that cemeteries used to be considered a waste of land, and now green burial is considered a way to actually protect wilderness. This organization, the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance, its parent organization was the Keweenaw Green Cemetery Association, because 10, 12, 14 years ago, people decided they wanted a conservation cemetery here. That turned out to be a lot more challenging. So it morphed into us trying to work with existing cemeteries to bring green burial into the picture. So for a lot of people, green burial turns out to be a better option than cremation. In terms of scattering ashes, not a problem. Ashes are considered an inert substance. Some people call that a waste of good nutrients because you just burn them up. But as an inert substance, it's perfectly legal to scatter them into Lake Superior or into other areas. The one thing I know is that the national parks and other places, if people are going to scatter ashes, they request that you do it in a way where it's not just a pile of bone fragments, because when people find those, then they have to investigate. So hopefully that covers the essence of the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, Jen Donovan shared a link to the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance website and has the question that I'm sure everyone would be interested in the answer is, what is the public's main concern or resistance to green burial, and why do most funeral directors not support the concept?
Interesting question. I'm going to tackle the second part first. Why do most funeral directors not support the concept? And I'm going to say that actually up here, we're very delighted that most funeral directors do support green burial. I think we have just 3 in the, I call the Tri-County area, Ontonagon, no, 4 counties, Ontonagon, Houghton, Keweenaw, and Baraga. I think just 3 funeral directors who have never responded to our sort of overtures or outreach about green burial. But we have 6 now in the local area, one of them in Baraga County, Susan Jacobs of the Jacobson Funeral Home, who do support green burial. And nationwide, it's happening. If you read the funeral director literature, etc., as a whole, funeral directors are coming to realize that green burial is coming, it's here, it's happening, and they need to adapt. Now, different funeral directors will support it differently, because some are more comfortable with some practices than others, but we're fortunate up here. It also brings up the point that why the organization is so important, because when individuals go to funeral directors and ask for really unusual things, they can easily get rebuffed. But when an organization exists, and that organization can say, we have almost 100 members, and we want to meet with you to talk about green burial, they listen more closely and they start to open up their minds a little bit more, because they understand that there's actually a whole bunch of people who are interested. Now, the public, their main concern or resistance to green burial, it's kind of all over the map. Part of it is that it's change. You know, I'm a local kid with a lot of family up here. I go to a lot of funerals. And up here, most funerals are still extremely traditional. The body is embalmed. There's a viewing and visitation with an open casket. There's a church service. And there's this idea that, well, once you close the casket, bring it to the cemetery, then other people take over and go from there. It's simply, people are so used to that being the way that burial is done, because it's been that way for 2 or 3 generations now. And you have to realize that 3 generations ago, when people were striving, those things were a step up. You know, it was a big deal to have a fancy casket. It was important to show everybody else that you were taking care of this family member as best you could. And what that meant was all of these pieces of what we call conventional burial. The attitude is changing, but it's changing slowly. So one reason we always start with the definition of green burial is that until people hear the term green burial 3 or 4 times, they don't even register it. You know, I will still have people say, well, what is green burial? No matter how many times we're in the Gazette, no matter how much information we put out, no matter how many activities we do. So the other piece of resistance that comes up is concerns about, well, if you bury somebody in a shroud and you only bury them 3 feet deep, won't wild animals come and dig them up? We have bears and wolves up here. Another one is, won't that pollute the groundwater? We had to tackle the wild animals piece back when Chassell was getting started, because they had people come to the township meetings and object on those terms. And we had to do a lot of research. We developed a white paper just on wild animals disturbing human graves. That was enough to allay the concerns of the Chassell Township supervisors and council members. The groundwater piece, generally cemeteries are located and designed in ways to minimize groundwater issues, even from conventional burial. And in my last discussion with the health department, the woman I talked with said that, well, you know, frankly, as long as the soil types are okay, et cetera, she is less worried about green burial than she would be about conventional burial. Just because, frankly, as any funeral director will tell you, in most cemeteries, those concrete vaults, no matter how well sealed they are supposed to be, they eventually fill with water, and that embalmed body will be swimming in water, and that water will sort of spread out with the groundwater. So those are usually the main concerns or pieces of resistance. Bottom line too is that some people don't like the idea of, you know, the worms crawling in and out, you know, the natural decomposition. So green burial, you know, it does take a certain kind of person who says, I want my body to be decomposing in a natural way, because I want to see it recreated as trees and forest and land. I want to be truly dust to dust. So Hopefully that tackles that question.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. I do want to mention that membership in the Keweenaw Green Burial Alliance is free. And so again, you could just go to the website and sign up if you're interested. Another question